Richard Caldwell shoved the iron gate shut with both hands, not closed, slammed, and turned to face his nephew with the particular sneer of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his bathroom mirror for years. "You don't belong here anymore," he said, loud enough that two groundskeepers 20 feet away suddenly found reasons to stare at the gravel. "Your father is gone. This estate, this family, this name, none of it is yours. Get off this property before I have you removed." Nathan Caldwell stood in the rain. 43 years old, holding a single cardboard box of personal items, water soaking through the shoulders of a jacket he hadn't thought to replace in 3 years, because he never cared much about jackets. He didn't shout, he didn't cry. He just looked at his uncle for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he always knew was broken but kept hoping wasn't. Then he turned around and walked back to his car. Oh, before we go any further into Nathan's story, if this is your first time here, take a moment right now and hit that subscribe button. Every week we bring you stories about real human struggle, quiet dignity, and the kind of justice that doesn't announce itself. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're watching from. We genuinely love knowing how far these stories travel. And if this one speaks to you, hit the like button. It means more than you know. Now, let's go back to that rainy afternoon, because what Richard Caldwell didn't understand was that he had just done his nephew the greatest favor of his life. The drive from Caldwell Estate to Nathan's apartment in the city took 47 minutes on a good day. That afternoon, with the rain and a minor accident backed up on Route 9, it took an hour and 20. Nathan spent most of it in silence, one hand on the wheel, the cardboard box riding shotgun. Inside the box, a framed photograph of his father taken sometime in the late 90s, a small brass compass that had belonged to his grandfather, 3 handwritten letters he'd found years ago and kept without ever fully explaining why, and a child's drawing, crayon on construction paper, a house, and 2 stick figures that his son Eli had made when he was 4. Eli was 7 now. Nathan glanced at the drawing at a red light. The crayon house had a crooked chimney and grass that was more yellow than green. The 2 stick figures were labeled in unsteady capital letters, Daddy and Me. He looked away before the light changed. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had been described in its original listing as charming and full of character, which is realtor language for narrow hallways, radiators that clanged like someone trapped inside the walls, and windows that faced directly into the ventilation shaft of the Thai restaurant below. Nathan had moved in 6 years ago, shortly after his divorce, when Eli was 14 months old and Nathan was still in the phase of believing that the smallness of his living situation was temporary, a sprint, not a marathon. He carried the box upstairs, unlocked the door, and set it on the kitchen counter next to a coffee mug he hadn't washed from that morning. The apartment smelled like takeout containers and old paper. Douglas had been a quiet man, methodical, not given to dramatic declarations or large emotional gestures. He showed love in logistics, in planning, in preparation, in making certain that the people he cared about would be okay after he was gone. He'd started declining 2 years ago, a slow process that the doctors had a name for, and that Nathan had experienced simply as watching his father become smaller, degree by degree, until one morning in March there was a phone call, and then there wasn't a father anymore. The estate, as it turned out, had gone entirely to Nathan. Not because Douglas had excluded Richard out of spite, but because that was where Douglas believed it belonged, and Douglas had been remarkably precise about documenting why. The will was clear. The legal paperwork was thorough. Margaret, who was a family law attorney, one of the several things Nathan had not fully appreciated about her until it was too late, had told him on the phone that Richard had almost no viable path to challenge it. Richard, predictably, had begun challenging it immediately. Nathan hadn't gone to the estate that afternoon to fight. He'd gone to pick up the box. His father's study had contained a few items Douglas had specifically mentioned wanting Nathan to have: the photograph, the compass, some letters. And Nathan had arranged with the estate's property manager to come by and collect them during a window when supposedly Richard wouldn't be present. Richard had been present. His name was Nathan Douglas Caldwell, and if you asked people who knew him to describe him, most of them would take a moment and then say something like steady. He was the kind of person you noticed more in retrospect than in real time. Not flashy, not loud, not particularly interested in being the most compelling person in any given room. He'd built his consulting firm, Caldwell Strategic Partners, from a spare bedroom and a laptop he'd bought secondhand, growing it over 12 years into an operation with 43 employees and clients in 7 states. He wasn't famous. He wasn't a household name. He went to his son's school events and paid his taxes, and occasionally forgot to eat lunch and kept a running list of books he meant to read someday on a notepad beside his bed. He'd been a decent husband, he thought, though Margaret might have organized that assessment differently, and she wouldn't have been wrong to. The divorce had happened for reasons that were nobody's villain story. They had grown into different shapes. The version of Nathan who worked 18-hour days to build something real had not left much room for the version of Nathan who was supposed to also be a present and available partner, and Margaret had been honest about that before she had been finished with it, which was more consideration than he probably deserved. They co-parented well, which was the phrase people used to mean. They had managed to be decent to each other even when being decent was hard, and their son would not grow up thinking that love always ended in damage. Eli called him every other night. They had a thing where they'd each describe one good thing and one bad thing from the day. Eli's good things were usually specific: a goal he'd scored at recess, a funny thing his teacher said, a book he'd liked. His bad things tended toward the philosophical for a 7-year-old. Nobody wanted to play the game I made up, or I was sad, but I didn't know why. Nathan wrote them down afterward in a small notebook. He didn't know why. He just did. 1. 2 days after the scene at the estate gates, Nathan was sitting across from his attorney, a small and precise woman named Sylvia Ostroff, who had represented him since the early days of Caldwell Strategic Partners, and had a habit of clicking her pen 4 times before saying anything important. She clicked her pen 4 times. "The estate is yours," she said. "I want to be unambiguous about that. Richard can file whatever motions he wants. He will spend money doing it. He will not succeed." "I'm not worried about the estate," Nathan said. Sylvia looked at him over her reading glasses. "What are you worried about?" "I'm not worried about anything. I'm just tired of the whole—" He paused, searching. "The whole performance of it. Him standing there in the rain like he'd just won something." "He hasn't won anything." "I know that." "Does he?" Nathan smiled, though it didn't quite reach all the way. "Not yet." Sylvia set her pen down, which meant she was about to say something she hadn't planned to say. "Nathan, I want to bring something up, and I want you to hear it in the spirit in which it's intended." "Okay." "Your father's property on Meridian Hill." The room did something strange for a moment. Nathan hadn't thought about the Meridian Hill property in almost 2 years, hadn't let himself think about it, which was a different thing. His father had acquired it quietly, 7 years ago, in one of those transactions Douglas arranged without making announcements, the way he did most things. Nathan had found out about it the way he found out about most of his father's deliberate kindnesses, too late and secondhand. "You haven't moved in," Sylvia said. "I know. You've been paying the property taxes, the maintenance fees, the utilities." "I know. On an apartment with a ventilation shaft view." He looked at her. "Margaret told you about the ventilation shaft." "Margaret and I have lunch occasionally." Sylvia retrieved her pen. "Nathan, that property has been sitting there, fully maintained, completely ready, for 7 years. Your father specifically arranged it for you. He wanted you to have a home that, and I'm quoting directly from the documentation here, reflects what you've built and who you are, not what you've been willing to settle for." The silence that followed was the kind that had some weight to it. Nathan stared at a point somewhere past Sylvia's shoulder. Outside her office window, the city moved in its usual indifferent way: taxis and pedestrians, and a man struggling with an umbrella that had inverted in the wind. "I kept thinking I'd go when things settled down," he said finally. "Things don't settle down," Sylvia said, with the certainty of someone who had been practicing law for 31 years. "You know that. Eli's school is in the city. Meridian Hill is 40 minutes from Eli's school. I've driven it." She clicked her pen twice. "I timed it." Nathan laughed, a real one this time, surprised out of him. "You timed it." "I had concerns." He looked at his hands on the table. The compass from his father's study was in his jacket pocket. He'd been carrying it since that afternoon, a habit he hadn't examined. "He said I didn't belong there anymore," Nathan said, not bitterly, just as a fact he was setting on the table to look at. Sylvia didn't say anything. "And I thought, standing there in the rain, walking back to my car, I thought, you're right, I don't. I never did belong there. That was never going to be the place. He stopped, started again. I think I was holding on to it because my father loved it, not because I did. Sylvia nodded once, slowly. I'll call the property manager, Nathan said, tomorrow morning. I already sent her your contact information, Sylvia said. 2 days ago. He stared at her. You were going to come to this conclusion, she said unapologetically. I just wanted to be ready. He called Eli that night during their usual window after dinner. One good thing, Nathan said. Eli thought about it. I figured out how to do a cartwheel. Almost. My hands kept slipping. That counts as progress. Does it count as the good thing? Absolutely. Okay. A pause, the sound of Eli repositioning himself on whatever surface he was sitting on. One bad thing. Tommy Marsh said my dinosaur project was too long. How long was it? 14 pages. That's not too long for a dinosaur project. That's what I said. Eli's voice carried the particular satisfaction of having his assessment confirmed. What's yours? Good thing first. Nathan thought about Sylvia's office, the pen clicking, the window with the man and the inverted umbrella. I made a decision today, he said. A good one. One that was a long time coming. What kind of decision? The kind where you stop waiting for things to be perfect and you just move. Eli processed this. Like when I was scared to jump off the diving board? Exactly like that. And then you jumped and it was fine? Better than fine, Nathan said. Yeah. There was a comfortable quiet. 7-year-olds were surprisingly good at comfortable quiet, Nathan had discovered, when they were in a good mood and not actively requiring entertainment. Dad? Yeah, bud? Is the bad thing the same as the good thing sometimes? Nathan sat back in his kitchen chair. The ventilation shaft hummed faintly below. The radiator knocked twice and went quiet. Yeah, he said. Sometimes it really is. He didn't sleep well. That wasn't unusual. Around 2 in the morning, he got up and made coffee he didn't particularly want and stood at his kitchen window looking at the narrow slice of sky visible above the building across the alley. A band of dark gray cloud lit from below by the city, the particular non-darkness of urban night that never quite became anything else. He thought about his father. Douglas Caldwell had not been an expressive man. He hadn't said things like I love you easily or often, hadn't been one for long emotional conversations or tearful reconciliations. What he had done, Nathan understood now, was plan. He had loved in the architecture of things, in provisions and preparations, in documents filed carefully and arrangements made quietly without being announced. The Meridian Hill property was that, a letter written in real estate instead of words. I see what you've built. I see who you are. Here is a place that matches it. You don't have to settle. Nathan had read it as, someday, when you're ready. He understood now that his father had meant, you're already ready. You've been ready. Go. He finished the coffee. He rinsed the mug. He went back to bed, and this time he slept. The next morning, he called the property manager at Meridian Hill and told her he was coming. Mr. Caldwell, she said, and he could hear genuine warmth in her voice. Your father told me you'd call eventually. He said to tell you, and I'm reading directly from a note he left me. I hope that's all right. He said to tell you, it's been waiting, so have I. Nathan sat with that for a moment. The compass was on the nightstand. Outside, the city was already doing what cities do. I'll be there tomorrow morning, he said. We'll be ready, she said. He ended the call. He sat on the edge of his bed. Then he got up, opened his closet, and started finding boxes. He owned 3 cardboard boxes and a duffel bag, which was a strange thing to realize about yourself at 43. Not that he was a man without possessions. The apartment had furniture, dishes, a reasonably good coffee maker he'd bought after the divorce because Margaret had kept the old one in the morning without decent coffee had been the first genuinely intolerable thing about living alone. But furniture belonged to a place, not to a person, and Nathan had never bought any of it with the feeling that he was building something. He'd bought it the way you buy things for a temporary situation that goes on long enough to require a couch. Standing in the middle of his living room at 7 in the morning with packing tape and a marker, he understood that he had been living inside a waiting room for 6 years without quite admitting it to himself. He started with the things that were actually his, the books he'd read and intended to reread, the small collection of objects on his desk that meant something to him privately, Eli's drawings that he'd taped to the refrigerator and kept rotating as new ones arrived. There were 11 drawings total. He took them down carefully, stacking them by date, oldest on the bottom, the way you'd preserve something that mattered. The one of the house with the crooked chimney he set on top. The packing took most of the morning. It shouldn't have, there wasn't much, but he kept stopping, not out of sentimentality exactly, but out of something harder to name. A recognition, maybe, that when you leave a place, even a place you never loved, you leave a version of yourself behind in it. The Nathan who had moved into this apartment was 37 years old and freshly divorced and carrying Eli in a car seat and convinced that difficulty was a phase. That Nathan had made coffee in this kitchen every morning for 6 years. He had answered work calls from this window and argued on the phone with insurance companies from this couch and cried twice in this bathroom. Once after the first Christmas without Eli, once after a conversation with his father that he still thought about sometimes. A conversation where Douglas had said things he clearly needed to say, but had run out of time to say properly. Nathan taped the last box, labeled it miscellaneous in the resigned way you label a box when you've stopped caring about organization, and stood up. He called his building manager to arrange the key return. He scheduled the moving company for noon. Then he poured himself the last cup of coffee the apartment would ever make him, sat down on the couch one final time, and called his son. "You're moving today?" Eli said. His voice had the tone of someone processing news that was interesting but also slightly alarming. "Today's the day." "Is the new house big?" "Yeah, pretty big." "Bigger than Grandma's old house?" Nathan considered this. His mother's house, which she'd sold after moving to be closer to her sister in Tucson, had been a comfortable 3-bedroom colonial with a garden she was inexplicably proud of and a garage that had never once housed a car in Nathan's memory. "Bigger than that, yeah." "How big?" "You'll see it Thursday. I want you to see it fresh." Eli accepted this with the characteristic flexibility of a 7-year-old who had learned that some of his father's decisions were non-negotiable. "Is there a yard?" "There's a yard." "Can we get a dog?" Nathan had been expecting this question for approximately 3 years and still wasn't prepared for it. "Let's talk about the dog situation when you visit." "That means maybe." "It means let's talk about it." "Okay." Eli paused. "Dad, why are you moving now? Like, why today?" Nathan set his coffee cup down. Outside, the ventilation shaft made its usual sounds. "Because," he said, "I waited long enough." Eli seemed to find this satisfactory. Kids often accepted honesty better than adults expected, maybe because they hadn't yet learned that simple answers were supposed to be suspicious. "Okay," Eli said. "I hope the new house is good." "Me too, bud." "Bud, tell me one thing about it." Nathan thought for a moment. "There's a room I haven't even opened the door to yet." "Why not?" "Because I'm saving it." "For what?" "For when I see it with you." There was a brief silence, and then Eli said, with the slightly abashed tone of a child who feels something more than he wants to admit, "Okay, Thursday." "Thursday," Nathan confirmed. He ended the call, finished the coffee, and went to unlock the door for the movers. The property manager's name was Helen Marsh, no relation to the Tommy Marsh who'd criticized Eli's dinosaur project, though Nathan would think of that coincidence later and find it faintly amusing. She was a compact, efficient woman in her mid-60s with close-cropped gray hair and a posture that suggested she had once served in the military or grown up with someone who had. She was standing at the front entrance of Meridian House when Nathan's car came up the long gravel drive, holding a clipboard and a set of keys on a wooden fob, and she did not wave or perform any of the cheerful gestures Nathan might have expected. She simply watched him park, waited for him to get out, and then extended her hand. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "I'm Helen." "Nathan," he said. She nodded once, as if this was the correct answer. "I've been managing this property for 6 years. Your father had very specific ideas about how it should be maintained. I want you to know that everything is in working order. The systems were all inspected in September, and the gardens are behind but recoverable. We had a dry summer." "I don't know much about gardens," Nathan said. "Most people don't," Helen said without judgment. "That's what maintenance contracts are for." She turned toward the door. "I'll walk you through the main house first, then the grounds. Then I'll leave you the documentation and the access codes and let you have the rest of the afternoon to yourself." He followed her in. The first thing Nathan noticed was the light. Meridian House sat on a hillside with its back toward the west, and in the morning hours, the east-facing windows pulled in the kind of clean, direct sunlight that is genuinely different from the smudged, borrowed light of an apartment that shares a wall with 6 other apartments. It came through the wide windows of the entry hall and laid itself across the hardwood floors in long rectangles, and Nathan stood just inside the door for a moment, taking this in without speaking. The floors were refinished last year, Helen said, consulting her clipboard. Original oak. Your father was very particular about keeping them original. Nathan nodded. He recognized something in the details. In the original oak floors and the maintained garden and the systems inspected in September. It was his father's handwriting, expressed in materials instead of ink. The main hall opened into a living room that was larger than his entire apartment. The ceilings were high, not absurdly, performatively high, but genuinely high. The kind that made sound behave differently, gave conversation a slightly different quality. The furniture was present but minimal, tasteful in the way that suggests someone chose it carefully and then stopped, leaving room for a life to grow into the space rather than filling it all in advance. Nathan walked slowly through the room, trailing his hand along the back of a long neutral couch, looking at the bookshelves that lined one wall. They were mostly empty. His father had left him the shelves but not the books, which was, Nathan realized, exactly right. The kitchen was updated 4 years ago, Helen said from behind him. Your father oversaw it personally. He had opinions about countertop height. Did he? He did. They are the correct height, as it turns out. I've cooked in there twice, testing the equipment, and he was right. Nathan stopped walking and looked at her. She was looking at her clipboard with the expression of someone who has just revealed more than she intended. You cooked in here, he said. I tested the equipment, she said, not looking up. Professionally. What did you make? A pause. Pasta. Both times. Was it good? Helen clicked her pen. A different gesture than Sylvia's, more brisk, less portentous. The equipment works correctly, she said. That's the point. Nathan smiled. It was the first time all morning that something had felt normal. The office on the second floor stopped him. It was a corner room, east and north windows, a view that took in the long slope of Meridian Hill down to where the tree line began and the distant suggestion of the river valley beyond. There was a desk, a real one, solid and wide, the kind built to hold work rather than the performative suggestion of it. There were built-in shelves here too, also mostly empty. There was a leather chair behind the desk that had the look of something chosen by someone who understood that you spent real hours in chairs and that comfort wasn't vanity. Nathan stood in the doorway for a long moment. Your father used this room when he visited, Helen said behind him. She said it carefully, with the practiced restraint of someone who had thought about how to say it. Nathan looked at the desk, at the chair, at the light coming in from both windows, crossing each other on the floor. How often did he come? He asked. Every few months, toward the end. He'd drive up, spend a day or two. Sometimes he'd work in here. Sometimes he'd just sit. She paused. He talked about you often. Nathan didn't say anything. He was proud of you, Helen said. And then, as if this had been too naked, she added immediately, the south-facing window in the hallway has a latch that sticks in cold weather. I'll show you the trick. He appreciated her for that, for knowing when to cover the moment with something practical. By 3 in the afternoon, the movers had unloaded his 3 boxes and the duffel bag into the entryway. They took up approximately the same visual space as a pile of groceries in the middle of a gymnasium floor. Nathan stood looking at them after the moving truck pulled away. Mr. Caldwell, Helen said, appearing from the kitchen with the documentation folder. I want to be clear that you shouldn't feel any particular way about how the house looks right now. Every house looks wrong when it's being moved into. It looks like itself in a few months. How many houses have you managed? 14 over the years. She handed him the folder. Access codes on the first page, utility contacts on the second, maintenance schedule behind the blue tab. My number is on the front. If something breaks or doesn't work, call me first, not the contractors. I know which contractors to trust and which ones to avoid. Which ones should I avoid? Everyone who advertises on the highway billboard outside Millbrook, she said without hesitation. And the plumbing company with the truck that has the fish on it. I don't know why the fish, but the work is bad. Nathan looked at her. How do you feel about dogs? Helen closed her clipboard. I think a dog would suit this property. Yeah? The yard is appropriate. The neighborhood is quiet enough. You'd want to fence the north side. There's a gap in the hedgerow where a medium-sized dog could get through. She considered this. Don't get anything too small. Small dogs don't match the space. Nathan found himself laughing quietly. I'll keep that in mind. She extended her hand again. I'll leave you to it then. Call if you need anything. Helen, she paused. Thank you for taking care of this place. For 6 years. She looked at him with the expression of someone absorbing a compliment and deciding what to do with it. It was a good property to manage, she said finally, and your father was a good client. She paused once more at the door. He really was proud of you. I'm not just saying that to be kind. She left before he could respond, which he thought she may have intended. He spent the first hour just walking through the house, not unpacking, not organizing, not making lists of what he'd need to buy, just walking. Through the main rooms, up the stairs, along the upstairs hallway, with its pale walls and the afternoon light moving across them as the sun shifted. He opened every door except one, a room at the end of the east hallway that he'd decided impulsively that morning on the phone with Eli to leave sealed until Thursday. The room he did allow himself to look at most carefully was the office. He sat in his father's chair, which was now, he supposed, his chair, though it didn't feel that way yet, and he looked out the north window at the hill and the tree line. The river valley was doing something complicated in the late afternoon light, layers of shadow and amber that changed every few minutes as the sun moved. He sat there for a while, not working, not doing anything productive, just sitting in his father's chair looking at his father's view. Douglas Caldwell had sat in this chair in these last years when his body was failing him and looked at this same view. Nathan tried to imagine what his father had thought about, sitting here. He suspected Douglas had not thought in dramatic arcs. His father wasn't a man who narrated himself to himself. He had probably sat here and worked for a while and then stopped working and looked at the hill and then maybe thought about Nathan and maybe thought about what he still needed to arrange. And then he had probably driven home and not mentioned it to anyone. That was his father. Loving in logistics, grieving in preparation, saying things with property deeds and access codes and notes left with property managers. It's been waiting. So have I. Nathan's throat did something he hadn't given it permission to do. He let it. He was alone in a house on a hill with a folder of access codes and 3 cardboard boxes and 6 years of waiting room living behind him. And his father had spent 2 years driving up here quietly in the months before he died, just to sit in this chair and look at this view and probably think about his son. He let himself feel what that was. It took a few minutes. Then it passed, the way things do, into something quieter. He ordered food from a place Helen had noted in the documentation folder, decent local options listed on the last page, which he found both thorough and touching, and ate it sitting on the wide back porch as the last of the daylight left the hill. The porch had a wooden table that needed sanding and 2 chairs that didn't match each other, which somebody had placed there at some point, seemingly without caring that they didn't match. He sat in one of them and put his feet up on the porch railing and ate his food and listened to the sounds of Meridian Hill, which were very different from the sounds of his apartment. There were birds, not the incidental city birds, pigeons and sparrows threading through steel and exhaust, but actual birds in actual trees doing actual bird things in the early evening. There was wind in the hedgerow along the north edge of the property. There was, somewhere down the hill, the sound of a dog barking twice and then stopping. Not the urban bark of a dog jammed into a too small situation, but the measured bark of an animal that had something specific to say and said it. His phone rang. He looked at it. Not Eli, not Margaret, not Sylvia. The number was his uncle's. He sat with the phone in his hand for 3 rings. On the 4th, he answered. Richard, he said. There was a pause on the other end. The pause of someone who had prepared for voicemail and had to reorganize. Then Richard's voice came through, careful and assembled, the voice of a man who had decided to try a different approach. Nathan, I'm glad you answered. What do you need, Richard? I think we got off on the wrong foot the other day. Richard Caldwell had the vocal quality of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the best speaker usually won, which meant he could make an insincere thing sound almost sincere when he needed to. I was upset. Your father's passing has been hard on all of us, and I reacted in a way that wasn't Richard. Nathan kept his voice even. I know what you're doing. A beat. What do you think I'm doing? You talked to a lawyer, and the lawyer told you the will is airtight, so now you're trying a different door. Nathan took a bite of his food. He was genuinely hungry and saw no reason to perform otherwise. It's fine. I understand the impulse. The silence on Richard's end was a different kind of silence this time, the compressed silence of a man recalibrating. I'm not your enemy, Richard said, with less warmth than before. You're not my enemy, Nathan agreed. You're also not someone I have anything to work out with. Dad left the estate to me. The documentation is complete. Sylvia Ostroff will be happy to walk you through it again if you need her to. He paused. I'm not going to fight with you. I'm also not going to pretend the conversation at the gate didn't happen. I was upset, you said. Nathan looked out at the hill. The light was almost gone now, just a thin residual brightness at the horizon. Richard, go talk to your lawyer. Do whatever you feel you need to do. But don't call me to manage the conversation. I'm not interested in that version of things. Another long pause. You sound different, Richard said finally, and it was the most unguarded thing he'd said in the entire call, which meant it was probably true. I moved today, Nathan said simply. Moved where? Nathan looked out at the hill, at the last light on the tree line, at the garden that was behind but recoverable. The dry summer's fault, not the garden's. Somewhere that was waiting for me, he said. Good night, Richard. He ended the call. He set the phone face down on the table and finished his dinner in the dark, listening to the birds wind down for the night and the wind in the hedgerow. And somewhere down the hill, the dog, who had found something else to say. He sat there for a long time after the food was gone. The chair was uncomfortable. It was the mismatched one, slightly lower than the other, and the railing was at an awkward height for his feet. He stayed in it anyway. Sometimes the imperfect version of a thing was still the right version, just because it was actually there and you were actually in it, not waiting in a waiting room somewhere to find out if something better was coming. He would need to buy furniture, real furniture, chosen deliberately. Not the way you furnished a temporary situation, but the way you furnished a life. He would need to learn the property, the way the light moved through it at different hours, which doors stuck and which didn't, where the gap in the hedgerow was that would let a medium-sized dog through. He would need to tell his team at Caldwell Strategic Partners his new address. He would need to find out whether the school bus ran anywhere near Meridian Hill on his custody weeks, or whether the drive would need to be his. There were 100 logistics. There always were. He sat in the imperfect chair in the full dark of the porch and let the list exist without attacking it, because attacking lists at night was a young man's mistake, and he was not as young as he used to be, and he had learned a few things. Upstairs, the documentation folder sat on the kitchen counter with the access codes on the first page and the maintenance schedule behind the blue tab. In the east hallway, at the end, a door stayed closed and waiting. 3 boxes and a duffel bag sat in the entry hall, still unpacked. And Nathan Caldwell, who had walked away from a gate in the rain 4 days ago carrying a cardboard box, and what his uncle believed was nothing, sat on the back porch of Meridian House, in a mismatched chair and breathed the night air, and felt, underneath everything, underneath the grief and the logistics and the quiet, strange weight of beginning, the first clear shape of something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Not triumph, not relief exactly, just the particular, simple, grounding recognition of a man who has finally sat down somewhere he actually lives. He slept better than he had in years, which surprised him. He'd expected the strangeness of a new place to keep him up, the unfamiliar sounds, the different quality of the dark, the way new spaces have their own breathing patterns that take time to learn. But Meridian House was quiet in a way his apartment had never managed, even on its best nights. And sometime around 10:30, he lay down on the air mattress he'd thought to bring. The actual bed was being delivered Friday, and was asleep before he'd finished the thought he'd started. He woke at 6:15 to birds again. Not an alarm, just birds, doing what birds did on a hillside in the early morning, indifferent to his schedule and his adjustment period, and every other human concern. He lay there for a few minutes, listening to them, staring at a ceiling that was higher than his old one, in a room that smelled like wood and something faintly herbal, lavender maybe, from whatever Helen had used when she cleaned, and let himself feel the full strangeness of it without trying to resolve it into something more comfortable. He was here. He had moved. The waiting room was behind him. That was enough to hold on to for a Wednesday morning. He made coffee in the kitchen. The equipment worked correctly. Helen had been right. Douglas's opinions about countertop height were vindicated. And took it to the back porch, where the mismatched chairs were still sitting exactly as he'd left them the night before. The hill in the morning was completely different from the hill at dusk. The light came in at a low angle that made the grass look almost silver, and the tree line was doing something complicated with mist that sat in the low places between the trunks and caught the early sun. Nathan sat in the less comfortable chair again. He had already, without deciding to, made it his chair, the way you do, and drank his coffee and didn't think about anything in particular. This lasted about 11 minutes before his phone started. The first call was from Kevin Park, his operations director at Caldwell Strategic Partners, with a question about a contract clause that could have been an email, but Kevin was a verbal processor who thought better out loud. The second was from his accountant about the tax documentation for the estate transfer, which required 20 minutes and a promise to send paperwork. The third was from a number he didn't recognize, which turned out to be a journalist from a regional business publication who had somehow learned about Douglas Caldwell's death and wanted a comment on the succession of the family estate, which Nathan declined with the specific, courteous finality he had developed over years of not wanting to give comments to publications about his private life. By 8:30, the morning had become a regular morning, which was both a disappointment and a relief. He took the calls from the porch, pacing the length of it during the longer ones. And between calls, he looked at the hill and the garden and the gap in the hedgerow along the north side that Helen had mentioned. He could see it from here, a slightly lighter patch where the bushes grew thin. Medium-sized dog. He kept coming back to that. At 9, he pulled up his work calendar and looked at what the week held. 2 client calls Thursday morning, a team check-in Friday afternoon, a proposal deadline on Monday that his project lead had flagged as concerning. He made notes. He sent 3 emails. I was deep into reviewing a contract revision when he heard gravel crunching in the front drive and looked up. A car he didn't recognize had parked near the gate. A man in his 40s was standing beside it, looking at the house with the particular expression of someone deciding how to approach a situation they hadn't fully thought through. He was wearing a good coat and holding car keys, and his posture was the careful posture of a man managing his own nervousness. Nathan went around the side of the house to the front. The man turned when he heard footsteps. He was maybe 45, trim, with the look of someone who ran or cycled and tracked it carefully. Nathan didn't recognize him. "Mr. Caldwell," the man said. "That's me," Nathan said. "My name is David Farron. I was your father's financial advisor for the last 9 years. He paused. "I'm sorry for your loss. He was a remarkable client, and I think a remarkable man." "Thank you," Nathan said. He studied Farron. "You drove up to Meridian Hill to tell me that?" Farron had the honesty to look slightly uncomfortable. "No. I drove up because I have something for you, and I've been sitting on it for a month trying to figure out the right time, and I decided there wasn't going to be a right time, so—" He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. Standard business size, sealed, Nathan's name written on the front in his father's handwriting. Nathan looked at it without reaching for it. "He gave this to me 2 months before he passed," Farron said. "He said to give it to you after you moved into Meridian House. He was very specific about that. Not after the funeral, not after the estate settled, after you moved into this house." He extended the envelope slightly. "I've been checking with Helen. She told me this morning." Nathan took the envelope. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was slight. 1 or 2 pages inside, maybe. His father's handwriting on the outside. The F in his name had the small distinctive hook at the top that Douglas had always made, as long as Nathan could remember. "Thank you," Nathan said, "for holding it." "Of course." Farron put his hands in his coat pockets. "I want you to know, if you ever want to talk about your father's financial arrangements, what he built, the thinking behind some of his decisions, I'm available. No agenda. He talked about you a lot, and I think some of what he told me might be useful to you at some point." "I'll call you," Nathan said. Farron nodded, and there was something in it, a genuine nod, not a professional one. "He was proud of you," Farron said. "I know people probably keep saying that, but I was in the room for a lot of conversations where your name came up, And I want you to know it was always the same. He'd get quieter and steadier, and it was very obvious how he felt. Nathan didn't trust himself to say anything useful, so he nodded. Farron got back into his car and drove away down the hill. Nathan stood in the front drive for a moment, holding the envelope, looking at his name in his father's handwriting. Then he went around back to the porch and sat down in his chair and opened it. There were 2 pages. His father's handwriting, small and precise, the way Douglas did everything. Nathan, if David has given you this, you've moved into the house. Good. I was starting to think I'd need to find a way to nag you from wherever I end up, which sounded exhausting for both of us. Nathan stopped. Read that sentence again. His father had made exactly 3 jokes in the entire letter he'd sent for Nathan's 40th birthday, and all 3 had been delivered in the same dry, matter-of-fact tone that this one had, as if humor were a tool Douglas kept in a drawer and brought out only when the job required it. He kept reading. I'm not going to tell you what to do with the house because you're 43 years old and you don't need me to. But I want to tell you why I bought it, because I think you'll understand better than you might have a few years ago. You spent too long trying to prove something to people who had already decided. I did the same thing at your age for different reasons, and I wasted a good 10 years on it. I bought this house because I wanted to give you a place that wasn't connected to anything you had to justify. Something that was just yours, outright, without history attached to it. The estate was your grandfather's, then mine. It has 30 years of complicated feelings built into the walls. This house has none of that. Start fresh. Fill it with your own things. Eli is going to love the yard. Don't wait too long to get a dog. He needs a dog. Nathan put the letter down and sat there for a minute. The hill was doing something with the morning light again. He picked the letter back up. I know you and Richard are going to have difficulty. I know this because I know Richard, and I know how he operates, and I'm sorry that the situation I'm leaving behind is going to cost you time and energy. The legal arrangements are as solid as I could make them. Trust Sylvia. She's smarter than everyone in every room she enters, and she's been doing this long enough to have seen every maneuver Richard is likely to try. The thing I want to say most, which is the thing I have always been worst at saying, I see what you built. Caldwell Strategic Partners, the way you run it, the people you've kept loyal over 12 years. I know how hard that is, and I know you did it on your own, and I was proud of it from the beginning, and I never said so clearly enough. That was a failure on my part. I'm saying it now. You are a good father. That matters more than any of the rest of it. The south-facing window in the upstairs hallway has a latch that sticks in cold weather. Lift the frame slightly before you try to turn it. Helen knows, but she'll forget to mention it. I love you, Dad. Nathan folded the letter carefully along its original creases. He put it back in the envelope. He sat with it in his hands and looked at the tree line for a while. Helen had mentioned the window latch. She hadn't forgotten. He thought his father might have predicted she would mention it and included it anyway, just to have the last word on something practical. One final logistics detail, issued from somewhere beyond logistics. He put the envelope in his jacket pocket, next to the compass. Thursday arrived the way important days do when you're waiting for them, too slowly, and then all at once. Nathan spent Wednesday in a controlled state of movement, unpacking the 3 boxes, arranging the books on the shelves in the study, driving into the nearest town to buy basic supplies, spending an uncomfortable 40 minutes in a furniture showroom where a salesperson named Brett had opinions about sectionals that Nathan did not share. He bought a proper kitchen table and 4 chairs, a reading lamp for the study, and a set of sheets for the bed that was arriving Friday. He drove back up the hill and put things where they seemed to belong and stood back and looked at each room, and some of them looked like they were getting somewhere, and some of them still looked like a moving box had exploded, and that was fine. Eli arrived at 10:15 Thursday morning, dropped off by Margaret, who pulled into the drive and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the front of Meridian House with an expression that Nathan couldn't read from the porch steps where he was waiting. She had been to Meridian Hill once before, years ago, before they separated, when Douglas had first told them about the property. She'd said at the time that it was extraordinary, and Nathan had agreed, and neither of them had pursued it further because that was the period when they were both too tired and too busy to pursue anything further. She got out of the car. Nathan, she said, Margaret. She looked at the house. It's beautiful, she said, without any edge to it. Margaret Caldwell, née Sears, was not a woman who performed feelings she didn't have. If she said it was beautiful, she meant it. It needs work, he said. Inside. It'll get there. She watched Eli launch himself out of the back seat and sprint toward the porch steps. He's been talking about this since Tuesday. The dog question came up again this morning, Nathan guessed. It came up Monday, Tuesday, and twice on Wednesday. She looked at him, a direct, not unkind look. You look different. I moved, he said. More than that. She seemed to consider saying something else, and then reconsidered in the way that people who have been married to each other and then haven't still sometimes do. He needs to be back by 6. He's got a thing tomorrow morning. I'll have him back by 5:30. She nodded. Then, unexpectedly, it was a good thing, Nathan, moving here. I think your dad knew what he was doing. Yeah, Nathan said. I think so too. She left, and Eli was already at the top of the porch steps, vibrating at a frequency that only 7-year-olds achieve, turning in a circle to try to see everything at once. Is this it? Eli said. Is this the whole house? This is it. Eli looked at the front of it. Then he looked at Nathan, then back at the house. It's really big, he said, in a tone that suggested this was both exciting and slightly overwhelming. Come on, Nathan said. I'll show you around. He'd thought about how to do this, whether to give a tour, room by room, or let Eli loose and see what he found. He decided on somewhere in between, main floor first, then upstairs, then the yard, then the room at the end of the hallway. Eli moved through the house the way kids move through new spaces, fast, and then suddenly stopped, fast, and then stopped again. He touched things. He tested the acoustics by saying hello in different rooms and listening to how it sounded. In the kitchen, he opened every cabinet. In the living room, he stood in the middle of the floor and turned around slowly, tilting his head back to look at the ceiling. The ceiling is tall, he said. It is. If you had a really long ladder, you could touch it. Probably. Do you have a really long ladder? Not yet, Nathan said. Eli accepted this and moved on. Upstairs, he ran his hand along the banister the whole way up, which was a thing he'd done on staircases since he was old enough to reach them. At the top, he looked down the hallway. The pale walls, the afternoon light, the doors. Which one's my room? He asked. Nathan hadn't called it that yet, even to himself. He'd thought of it as the guest room, the second bedroom, the room at the end of the hall. He hadn't called it Eli's room. Which one do you want? Nathan said. Eli walked the length of the hallway, pausing at each door, opening them briefly and looking in. 2 rooms on the left, the bathroom, the study on the right, and then at the end of the east hallway. The door Nathan had kept closed. Eli stood in front of it. What's in here? He said. I don't know, Nathan said. I haven't opened it. Eli turned and looked at him with the specific expression of a child encountering an adult statement that doesn't compute. You live here and you haven't opened a door? I was saving it, Nathan said, for right now. Eli looked at the door, then he looked at Nathan. Then he turned back to the door and reached up and put his hand on the knob with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood suddenly that this was a moment. He opened the door. The room was southeast facing, 2 windows, the morning light already shifted to afternoon gold by the time it reached this part of the house. It was larger than Nathan had known. The door framing hadn't suggested the depth of it. There was a window seat built into the far wall, below the southeast window, with the kind of low sill that was exactly the right height to sit in and look out. The walls were a neutral gray that the afternoon light turned warm. The floors were the same original oak as the rest of the house. It was, objectively, a good room. Eli walked in slowly. He went to the window seat and sat in it and looked out at the hill and the garden and the tree line. I can see really far from here, he said. Yeah. Is that a garden down there? It is. It needs some work, but it's there. Eli pressed his nose against the glass. Can we grow things? If you want. I want to grow tomatoes. My teacher said tomatoes are easy. Then we'll grow tomatoes. Eli was quiet for a moment, looking out the window. Nathan leaned against the doorframe and watched him and tried to memorize this. His son's profile against the afternoon light, the window seat, the hill outside. Dad, Eli said, without turning away from the window. Yeah. This is my room. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Nathan said. It is. Eli turned around. He had the particular face he got when something had landed somewhere real inside him. Not performed emotion, but the genuine kind, the kind that shows up in children before they've learned to manage it. I like it here, he said simply. Nathan nodded. He didn't trust himself to say much. Can we eat lunch? Eli said, pivoting with the fluid subject change of a 7-year-old whose feelings had been felt and could now be moved past. I'm starving. What do you want? Eli thought about it. Grilled cheese. I have bread and I have cheese, Nathan said. We're in business. They ate at the new kitchen table, the first meal at it, and Eli ate 2 full sandwiches and half of Nathan's, which was his characteristic approach to food when he was happy and comfortable. He talked about school, about the dinosaur project, about Tommy Marsh's unfair commentary, about a movie he'd seen at a friend's house that Nathan made a mental note to look up before deciding whether to endorse. Nathan mostly listened and ate and refilled Eli's water glass and felt the kitchen doing something around them, becoming a kitchen that belonged to something rather than a room with appliances in it. After lunch, they went out to the yard. Eli immediately identified the gap in the hedgerow. Nathan hadn't pointed it out or mentioned it, but Eli walked directly to the north side and found the thin place in the bushes and crouched down to look through it. A dog could get through here, Eli said. I know. So we'd have to fix it. We would. Before we get the dog. Nathan crouched down beside him. The gap was about 18 inches wide, the hedgerow thinner here because of a section that had never quite recovered from something. Drought maybe, or a hard winter. Through it you could see the neighbor's yard beginning, a sweep of long grass and a wooden fence beyond. Eli, Nathan said. Yeah. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Eli stood up straight and put his hands in his pockets, which was his posture for serious conversations. He'd had it since he was 5. Okay. If we get a dog, Nathan said, it needs to be a dog you're going to help take care of, not just play with. Actually, help take care of, which means when you're here, you help with feeding and walking and the other stuff. The poop stuff, Eli said. The poop stuff, yes. Eli considered this with the gravity it deserved. Okay, he said. I can do that. You sure? Dad. He said it the way kids say a parent's name when the parent is being slightly patronizing. I'm 7. I can handle dog poop. Nathan stood up. All right then. So we're getting a dog? We're getting a dog. Eli made a sound that was not quite a word, more of a compressed, high-pitched expression of pure satisfaction, and immediately began walking the perimeter of the yard in what appeared to be an assessment of its suitability, which Nathan found both endearing and entirely reasonable. In the late afternoon, Nathan sat in the study while Eli was occupied in his room doing something that involved what sounded like furniture being rearranged. He'd asked if he could move the small bookshelf to the window wall, and Nathan had said yes, and now there were sounds suggesting a 7-year-old taking this assignment seriously. Nathan was half reading a work document on his laptop and half listening to the sounds of Eli and the house getting acquainted, and he had the folder from Helen open beside him, and the letter from his father in his jacket pocket, and the compass on the desk. He wasn't doing any of this efficiently. He was doing several things badly and simultaneously, which was, he thought, actually an improvement over the careful compartmentalization of the apartment years, where everything had its place and its time because the spaces were small and the risk of feeling too much was managed by routine. His phone showed a message from Sylvia. Richard filed a preliminary motion this morning. Exploratory, no substance. I've seen this playbook before. Don't worry about it. He typed back, I'm not worried about it. She responded, good. Also, did you move? Yesterday. A pause. Then, good. About time. He set the phone down. The window in the study. The corner room, east and north, his father's chair, had shifted with the afternoon, the light coming now from the north window more than the east, flatter and cooler. The hill outside was in its mid-afternoon configuration, the mist long gone, the tree line sharp and clear against a sky that had gone from the morning's pale gold to a solid, settled blue. He thought about Richard's motion. He thought about it the way you think about a car alarm going off somewhere. Aware of it, mildly irritated, not especially concerned. Sylvia had handled litigation far more complicated than anything Richard could manufacture, and Douglas had spent considerable time and energy ensuring the documentation was bulletproof, and Nathan had the particular advantage of having done nothing wrong, which in legal matters turned out to be more useful than people expected. What Richard was fighting for, Nathan thought, was not really the estate. It was the version of the story where the family went the way he'd always believed it should, where Douglas's son was an afterthought, and Richard's patience and proximity finally paid off in the form of keys and deed and the weight of the Caldwell name settling onto his shoulders. He'd been telling himself that story for years. The will had interrupted it, and he was trying to find an edit. Nathan understood the impulse. He didn't have sympathy for it, but he understood it. He closed the work document and opened a different file. The proposal due Monday, the one his project lead had flagged. He read through it, made notes in the margins, sent a voice message to his lead with 3 specific suggestions, and closed the laptop. Eli's furniture rearrangement sounds had ceased, which either meant the project was complete or Eli had gotten distracted. Nathan suspected complete. Eli finished things, a trait Nathan recognized from his own wiring. He went down the hall and knocked on the door. "Come in," Eli said, with the authority of a person in their own space. The bookshelf had been moved to the window wall. Eli had also moved the small desk, which Nathan had placed roughly in the center of the room, to sit perpendicular to the window seat, facing the door. It was a better arrangement. The room had been reorganized by a 7-year-old in the space of an hour into something that made more sense than what Nathan had put in it. Eli was sitting on the window seat with a book. "You moved the desk," Nathan said. "It was facing the wrong way," Eli said, without looking up from the book. "Now it faces the door, which is better for thinking." "Where'd you hear that?" "I don't remember." He turned a page. "I think I just knew." Nathan leaned against the doorframe again. The room looked like a room that had an occupant. The bookshelf still only had 2 books on it, both Eli's, brought from his bag, but the space between them and the empty shelves looked like promise rather than emptiness. "We should put more books in here," Eli said, "for when I'm here." "What kind do you want?" "Dinosaur ones, obviously. And the ones with the maps." He glanced up. "And maybe the scary ones, but the ones that are scary in a good way, not the actually scary ones." "What's the difference?" Eli considered this seriously. "The good scary ones make you want to keep reading. The actually scary ones make you not want to sleep." "That's a useful distinction," Nathan said. "I know." Eli went back to his book. "Can we have dinner here before Mom picks me up?" "Yeah, I'll figure out what we have." "Can it be pasta?" Nathan thought of Helen, alone in this kitchen, twice, testing the equipment. "Pasta, both times." "Yeah," he said. "It can be pasta." He went back down to the kitchen and started looking through what he'd bought yesterday, and the house settled around him in the late afternoon. The way houses do when there are people in them who belong to each other, the rooms adjusting to the sounds and the warmth and the small, ordinary weight of a father and his son on a Thursday. It was not a perfect day. Nathan burned the first attempt at garlic bread and had to start over, and Eli spilled water on the table, and they both pretended more efficiently than was realistic that it hadn't happened. And the pasta was slightly overcooked because Nathan had been watching Eli describe his dinosaur project with both hands and forgotten to check the pot. The new table had a slightly uneven leg that rocked faintly when Eli leaned on it. The light in the kitchen at dinner was too bright on one side and not enough on the other, and Nathan made a note to get a different bulb. But Eli ate 2 bowls of pasta and talked without stopping for most of the meal, and the hill outside the kitchen window went dark in its particular hillside way, gradually and then all at once. And when Margaret came at 5:25, Eli hugged Nathan for a long moment at the front door before running to the car. "Thursday," Nathan called after him. Eli turned at the car door. "Every Thursday," he said, and got in. Nathan stood on the front steps as the car went down the drive and out through the gate. The evening had come up while they were having dinner, the way evenings did, and the hill was settling into its night sounds. The birds wrapping up, the wind in the hedgerow, somewhere the dog. He went inside. He washed the dishes by hand because the dishwasher was one of the things he hadn't figured out yet, and hand washing was something he knew how to do. He put the leftover pasta in a container in the refrigerator. He wiped down the new table and checked the leg wobble and decided it needed a shim, which he'd deal with tomorrow. He turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dark hallway. Upstairs, A room at the end of the east hall had a bookshelf by the window, and a desk facing the door, and two books on the shelf, and a window seat looking out over the hill. His father's letter was in his jacket pocket. His son had been here today, and had said, "This is my room," and had meant it. Nathan stood in the dark hallway of Meridian House and understood, with the particular clarity that comes not from revelation, but from accumulation. From a rainy afternoon at a gate and three cardboard boxes and a mismatched chair and pasta, and a 7-year-old rearranging furniture by instinct, that this was what beginning actually felt like. Not clean, not triumphant, just real and ongoing and his. The bed arrived Friday morning, which meant Nathan had slept 2 nights on the air mattress and woken both times with the particular stiffness of a man in his 40s who had made a practical decision that his body had opinions about. The delivery crew, 2 men named, according to their shirts, Dale and Marcus, carried the frame and mattress up the stairs with the professional efficiency of people who had navigated worse staircases than this one. And by 10:15, Nathan had a real bed in the master bedroom and could stop pretending the air mattress situation was fine. He tipped them well. Dale said the house was beautiful. Marcus said nothing but looked at the north window view for a moment before heading back downstairs. And Nathan thought that was probably the more genuine response. After they left, he stood in the bedroom looking at the bed, which was too large for the room's current furniture situation. Just the bed, a single lamp on the floor, his clothes in a pile on the chair he'd moved from the study temporarily. It looked like a hotel room that hadn't been finished yet, or maybe like the room of someone who had moved in 2 days ago and was doing it in pieces, which was accurate. He made the bed with the new sheets, straightened the pillow arrangement twice, and then gave up on it and went downstairs. The week following Eli's visit settled into a rhythm that was not yet comfortable but was beginning to develop the bones of one. Nathan worked from the study most mornings, the north window throwing its clean light across the desk, the hill visible beyond it in whatever configuration the weather had decided on that day. The commute to the city for in-person meetings was 40 minutes, as Sylvia had timed, which was longer than the 12-minute walk from his old apartment to his office, but was 40 minutes during which he was alone in a car on a road that went through actual countryside, and he found this a reasonable trade. He bought a shim for the kitchen table leg on Tuesday. He fixed the latch on the south-facing hallway window on Wednesday, lifting the frame slightly before turning, exactly as his father had written. He went back to the furniture showroom without Brett was helping another customer, and chose a second reading chair for the study that was the right height and color, and that he would probably second-guess for 2 weeks before deciding he'd been right the first time. The garden he approached cautiously. Helen had said it was behind but recoverable, and when Nathan walked it seriously for the first time that Friday, really walked it, not just looked at it from the porch, he understood what she meant. The beds were structurally sound, the layout thoughtful, whoever had designed it had known what they were doing. But a dry summer and what appeared to be several months of minimal intervention had left things overgrown in some places and sparse in others, and there were 3 rose bushes along the south wall that looked like they'd had a difficult year and were reserving judgment about next spring. Nathan did not know much about gardens. He knew this about himself. He took photographs of everything and sent them to Helen with the message, "Who do you trust for garden work?" She responded within 4 minutes with a name and number, and the note, "Tell her I sent you. She'll actually show up." The gardener's name was Carla, and she did actually show up, Saturday morning, early, in a truck that had seen significant use and held the kind of organized chaos of tools and soil amendments that suggested a person who knew what they were doing and had stopped caring what it looked like. She was in her 50s, deliberately unhurried, and she walked the garden for 20 minutes without saying much before she turned to Nathan and said, "It's been neglected, but it's not damaged. There's a difference." "Helen said you'd be able to tell," Nathan said. "Helen's right about most things." Carla crouched near one of the rose bushes and looked at it from close range. "These are fine. They're just angry. Give them a hard cut in late winter and they'll come back." "I have a 7-year-old who wants to grow tomatoes," Nathan said. Carla stood up. "Then we put in a raised bed on the south side near the wall. Good sun there. Tomatoes in spring." She looked at him. "You want to be involved or you want me to handle it?" Nathan thought about it. "Somewhere in between." "That works," she said. "Most people either want to do everything or nothing. The in-between ones are usually the ones who actually learn something." She came back on Monday, and they spent 2 hours in the garden together, Carla working and talking intermittently. Nathan doing what she directed and asking questions that she answered without condescension. By the end of it, he had dirt under his fingernails and a rudimentary understanding of why the north bed was underperforming and what to do about it. And he felt the specific satisfaction of physical work that showed immediate results. The kind of satisfaction that desk work, for all its rewards, never quite replicated. I was standing at the garden sink on the back porch, washing his hands, when his phone rang. Sylvia. Tell me something good, he said. Richard's motion was denied, she said. As I told you it would be. The judge took about 11 minutes to review it and found no grounds to proceed. He could hear paper moving on her end, Sylvia shuffling something into order. His attorney filed it with such thin supporting documentation that I genuinely suspect even Richard's own counsel knew it was a reach. But it was the move he needed to make to feel like he'd done something. What's next? Nathan asked. He dried his hands on an old towel hanging by the sink. He can file again with more substance, but he'd need new grounds, and the will is what it is. My honest assessment is that this was his opening salvo, and he'll take a few weeks to regroup. A pause. There's something else. Are you sitting down? I'm standing at my garden sink. That's not sitting down. Sylvia. All right. He heard her chair move. Richard reached out to two of your father's other advisors this week, David Farron and the estate's accountant, a woman named Phoebe Grant. He was asking questions about the Meridian Hill property specifically, how it was acquired, what it's assessed at, whether it was part of the estate's formal holdings at the time Douglas drew up the will. Nathan was quiet for a moment. The garden was behind him, Carla packing up her truck on the side drive. He's trying to argue the house should be part of the estate, Nathan said. That's what I suspect, yes. He's looking for a thread to pull on. Sylvia's voice was measured, the way it always was when she was about to say something important in a matter-of-fact tone. He won't find one. Your father structured the Meridian Hill transfer separately and well in advance of drawing up the estate documents. They're entirely distinct transactions, but I want you to know what he's doing because it means he's not letting go. I didn't expect him to let go quickly. No. Sylvia paused again. Nathan, I've dealt with a lot of family disputes over the years. What makes Richard dangerous in the limited way that he is, isn't that he has a strong case. It's that he has nothing else. The estate was the story he'd been telling himself for years about how his life was going to resolve. Without it, he has to build a different story, and that's harder than filing a motion. Nathan leaned against the porch railing. The back of the property was quiet. Carla's truck was around the side, her sounds muffled. The hill stretched out from the garden's edge, the same view from every angle, always doing something different with whatever light it had available. I know, Nathan said. I feel bad for him, in a limited way. You can feel bad for him and still defend what's yours. I know that too. Good. The sound of her pen clicking twice. I'll keep you updated. Call me if he contacts you directly again. He won't, Nathan said. He's moved to the legal theater. Direct calls were the warm-up act. Probably right, Sylvia said. How's the house? The question surprised him slightly. Sylvia didn't usually ask personal questions, or rather she asked them in such embedded, offhand ways that they were easy to miss. It's good, he said, getting there. Good, she said, and meant it, and hung up. What? The following week, Nathan drove into the city for a client presentation and 3 back-to-back meetings that left him flat by 4 in the afternoon, in the particular way that too much social performance leaves introverts flat, not unhappy, just depleted in a way that required specific recovery. He ate a sandwich at his desk at Caldwell's Strategic Partners, talked briefly with Kevin about the proposal that had gone out and been received well, and made himself stay through the 5 o'clock team call before he got in his car and drove back up to Meridian Hill. The 40 minutes on the road did what they'd been doing, which was give him the transition he hadn't known he needed. From the version of himself that ran meetings and managed people and tracked deliverables to the version that had dirt sometimes under his fingernails and a kitchen table with a shimmied leg and a son who wanted tomatoes in spring. He stopped at a market in the town below the hill, a small, independent place that he'd found by accident the previous week, run by a family whose name was on the sign out front, which sold produce from local farms and had a cheese counter staffed by a teenager who had clearly been forced to work there by parental decree but was grudgingly knowledgeable. Nathan bought vegetables, decent bread, and a wedge of something the teenager recommended without enthusiasm, but which turned out to be excellent. The drive up from the market to Meridian House took 8 minutes and climbed through three distinct changes in the tree cover, the road going from open to canopied to open again. And Nathan had started paying attention to this progression in a way that was new to him. Not as scenery exactly, but as something like orientation, a way of knowing where he was. I was making dinner when Helen called. I heard about the motion, she said, without preamble. Helen's phone calls operated on the assumption that context was for people with more time. Sylvia told you? Sylvia's assistant sent me a document update. I'm listed as a property contact. A brief pause. He's not going to win anything. I know. I just wanted you to hear it from someone who isn't your lawyer, which can sound like someone who's paid to be reassuring. Her voice was matter of fact. I managed this property for 6 years. I know every document your father filed in connection with it. It's clean. There's no thread. I appreciate that, Nathan said. He was stirring something on the stove, the phone wedged against his shoulder in the way that ergonomists disapprove of. Helen, can I ask you something? You can ask. When my father came up here in those last months, what was he like? The pause that followed was not an uncomfortable one. It was the pause of someone deciding how much honesty the question was asking for. Quieter than I imagined he'd been earlier in his life, Helen said finally. Not sad, just contained. He moved carefully. He thought before he spoke, more than most people do. Another pause. He was very interested in getting things right, in the details. He'd spend 20 minutes on something that most people would call minor, the angle of the garden gate, whether the latch on the window worked properly. She stopped. I think he was making sure the house would be right for you, that it would work the way it was supposed to. Nathan kept stirring, though the thing on the stove didn't require it. He didn't talk about being sick, Helen continued, not directly. But he moved like a man who was conscious of time, which is different from how most people move. A brief silence. I think he was very at peace with you, specifically. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but when he talked about you, he wasn't anxious. He was settled. Nathan took the pot off the heat. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. It's just what I observed. And then, in the tone of someone firmly redirecting, the north hedgerow gap needs to be addressed before you get the dog. Did Carla look at it? She flagged it. She's handling it next week. Good. Helen paused once more. Your father would have liked seeing you here, Nathan. That's all. She hung up in her characteristic way before the moment could get heavier than she intended it to be. Nathan stood at the stove for a minute. Then he plated the food, took it to the kitchen table with the shimmied leg, and ate alone with the hill going dark outside the window. And it was not a sad dinner. It was just a quiet one, the kind that has weight to it without being sorrowful. The kind you have when you're in the middle of something that matters and you know it. And the knowing makes even the ordinary moments feel like they're worth recording. Richard called again on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the motion was denied. Nathan almost didn't answer. He looked at the name on the screen for 2 rings and had the clear, measured thought that he did not have to take this call, that Sylvia had told him to route Richard through legal channels, that there was no version of this conversation that was going to be productive. He answered anyway, because he was his father's son, and Douglas Caldwell had never been able to entirely ignore a ringing phone from family, even family that had forfeited the right to the designation. Richard, he said. Nathan. His uncle's voice was different this time. Not the calculated warmth of the first call, not the assembled for negotiation register. He sounded older. I'd like to meet. In person. Not through attorneys. What would be the purpose of that? A pause. I want to talk. Without the performance of the legal process around it. Nathan was in the study, the north window dark now, 9 o'clock at night. The reading lamp was on, the chair from the showroom had been broken in over the past 3 weeks, and had proven itself. The compass was on the corner of the desk where he'd started leaving it. Richard, he said carefully, you filed a motion trying to claim my property 3 weeks ago. I know. That's not a starting point for a casual conversation. I know that too. Something in his voice that Nathan hadn't heard before, or hadn't heard in a long time. Something unguarded and a little rough. The sound of a man who had rehearsed less than usual. I know how that looked. I know how the whole how I've handled everything since Douglas passed. I'm not calling to apologize exactly. I don't, I'm not sure I'm there yet. But I'm calling because I've been sitting with some things, and I thought, he stopped, started again. I thought it was better to call than to not call. Nathan was quiet. This was genuinely more from Richard than he'd expected, and he didn't know what to do with it yet. You stood in the rain at the gate, Nathan said, and told me I didn't belong there anymore. Yes. And then you tried to take this house. Yes. And now you want to have a conversation. Yes. A long pause. I know how that sounds. What changed? Richard was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had the careful quality of someone choosing words from a limited supply. I went to the estate last week, walked through it. I've been managing it and fighting for it for months now. And I went there and I walked through it, and it felt like... He stopped. It felt like a house where someone died. It felt like a place I was taking care of because that's what I do. Take care of things, manage things, keep them running. Not because... He didn't finish. Nathan waited. Not because it was going to make me happy, Richard said, finally and flatly. I thought it would. I was so certain it would. Nathan sat with that. Richard Caldwell was 61 years old and had spent the better part of 2 decades organizing his life's meaning around a property that was no longer his and had possibly never made anyone particularly happy, and was now, on a Thursday night, on the phone, doing the thing that had clearly cost him something to do. I'm not going to invite you up here, Nathan said. Not yet. I'm not ready for that, and I don't think you've earned it. Fair, Richard said without argument. But I'm also not going to pretend this call didn't happen, because it took something for you to make it. Nathan paused. Tell your attorney to stand down on the Meridian Hill inquiry. That's over. If you want any kind of anything between us, that stops now. A long silence. Right, Richard said. And Richard, Nathan kept his voice level. I know you thought the estate meant you were the right person, the real Caldwell, the one who mattered. But that was never what it meant. It was just a house. Dad knew that. I think somewhere you do too. Richard didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was quiet and a little worn. Douglas was better at knowing things than most people. Yeah, Nathan said. He was. They ended the call without making plans, without promising anything specific, without wrapping it in language it wasn't ready for. Nathan set the phone on the desk and sat in the reading chair for a while. The call didn't resolve anything. It wasn't that kind of call. It was the kind that opens a door a crack and then stops, and whether the door ever opens further depends on things that haven't happened yet. Richard might stand down and might not. He might call again or might not. He might become something different from what he'd been, or he might reassemble and come back through legal channels in 3 months with a new strategy. Nathan didn't know. He couldn't know. What he knew was that he had answered the call and said what was true, and that was the only part of it he was responsible for. He picked up the compass from the corner of the desk. It had been his grandfather's, older than anything else he owned, the brass worn smooth in the places a hand would naturally hold it, the needle still accurate when you let it settle. His father had kept it for years before the letter had directed it into Nathan's cardboard box. He turned it in his hand a few times, the needle swinging and finding north again each time it stilled. He set it back on the desk, facing the same direction it always did. The dog arrived on a Saturday morning in early November, 3 weeks after the conversation with Richard, on a day when the hill had its first real cold, and the hedgerow gap had been properly closed, and the raised bed Carla had built along the south garden wall was resting under a layer of mulch, waiting for spring. He was a 2-year-old mixed breed from the county shelter, medium-sized, as Helen had advised, brown and white, with ears that couldn't agree on a consistent position and a tail that operated at a frequency slightly above the rest of his body. The shelter had named him Captain, which Nathan had planned to change and then didn't, because after 20 minutes it was clearly Captain, and that was that. Nathan had told Eli about the dog over the phone on Tuesday, after everything was arranged, timing it for maximum impact. The sound Eli made had been one Nathan intended to remember for a long time. He brought Eli up that Saturday, too. Margaret dropping him off at 9, giving the dog a long, assessing look before she drove away, saying only, "He's got good eyes," which Nathan took as approval. Eli spent the first 20 minutes of Captain's arrival lying on the living room floor at the dog's level, letting the dog investigate him at his own pace, which showed a patience and dog sense that Nathan found both surprising and not surprising at all. "He likes you," Nathan said, watching Captain circle Eli for the fourth time before finally settling beside him. "Dogs always like me," Eli said, with the serene confidence of someone reporting a known fact. "That true?" "Marcus at school has a dog named Pretzel, and Pretzel only ever sits with me when I visit." He scratched Captain behind the ears. "I have a thing with dogs." "Good," Nathan said, "because he's partly yours." Eli looked up. "Partly? You're here half the time. When you're here, you're responsible for him." Eli sat up fully, Captain immediately placing his head in Eli's lap. "I know, we talked about this. I can handle the poop stuff." "I remember." "So he's ours," Eli said. Nathan sat down on the living room floor, which was a thing he had not done in this room yet, and which felt slightly ceremonial without meaning to. Captain turned to look at him, then turned back to Eli, then appeared to decide that the most efficient approach was to position himself so both of them could reach him, which he did. "Yeah," Nathan said. "He's ours." They spent the morning introducing Captain to the property. The yard, the garden, the porch, the places where his food and water were, the area that was his to sleep in, and the area that was furniture Nathan preferred he not sleep on, a distinction Captain acknowledged with the selective attention of an animal who understood the rule and was reserving the right to revisit it. Eli walked the yard perimeter with him, showing him the closed hedgerow gap with the authority of someone who had personally overseen the decision to close it, which he had, in spirit. In the afternoon, while Eli was in his room reading and Captain was sleeping in a pile of himself in the hallway, apparently the hallway was his, Nathan sat in the study and opened the proposal his team had sent over for a potential new client, a mid-sized manufacturing company in the Northeast that was looking for the kind of strategic analysis Caldwell Strategic Partners did well. He read through it, made notes, sent feedback, and then sat back and looked at the north window. 3 months since the gate in the rain. 2.5 months since the first night on the air mattress. 2 months since Eli had sat in the window seat and said, "This is my room," with the certainty of someone stating geography. The study had filled in, slowly, the way his father had seemed to intend. Books on the shelves, his own, ordered and arrived a box at a time over the past weeks. The reading chair from the showroom, a second lamp on the desk because the original one wasn't quite enough for late-night work. The compass in its corner. His father's letter in the drawer. He'd moved it from his jacket pocket to the desk drawer, which felt like the right permanent location, close but not carried, accessible but not a weight. The house was not finished. It would not be finished for a while, possibly for a long time, because the kind of home it was becoming was the kind that filled in with use rather than decoration, that became itself through the accumulation of ordinary days rather than any single design decision. The kitchen table still had the shimmied leg. The master bedroom still felt slightly temporary, though less so than it had. The south garden wall's raised bed was waiting. The books on Eli's shelf were still only 4. But the north hedgerow gap was closed. The equipment in the kitchen worked correctly. The latch on the south-facing hallway window responded to the right touch. In the hallway, Captain slept with the specific, complete surrender of an animal that had decided it was home. Nathan's phone showed a text from Eli. "Can Captain sleep in my room tonight?" Nathan typed back. "He can try. He might decide the hallway is better." Eli: "I'll let him choose." Nathan looked at this for a moment. His son's casual 7-year-old wisdom about autonomy and dogs and letting things settle into their own right places. He thought about sending something back and then decided the conversation was already complete. He put the phone down and looked at the hill through the north window, the November afternoon going gray at the edges the way November did, and thought about his father sitting in this chair, in this room, looking at this same hill, working something out in his own quiet way. Douglas had known that Nathan would get here eventually. He'd arranged the house and left the letter and trusted the timing to his son, who had taken longer than he needed to and arrived exactly when he was supposed to. That felt true. Sitting in the study on a Saturday with a dog in the hallway and a boy in the bedroom and the hill going slowly gray. It felt like something his father would have agreed with, delivered in his characteristic way, not as a declaration, but as a fact noted without ceremony, the way you'd note that a window latch responds to the right pressure, or that a compass needle always finds north even after it's been moved, even after it swung wide, even after it's forgotten for a while which direction it was looking for. It always settles. Winter came to Meridian Hill, the way it came to most elevated places, earlier than expected, and with more conviction than the calendar suggested. By the second week of November, the mornings had frost on the garden beds, the kind that made the mulch. Carla had laid over the raised tomato bed, looked like it had been dusted overnight by something deliberate. Nathan started keeping a heavier jacket on the hook by the back door, the old one replaced with something that actually fit the weather, and he started his mornings 15 minutes earlier because Captain needed to go out regardless of temperature and had the cheerful indifference to cold that medium-sized dogs from shelters often develop, as if comfort is something they decided not to require. The routine of the house, over those first weeks of winter, became something Nathan could feel in his body, the way you feel a routine that's actually yours. Not the routine of someone managing a temporary arrangement, but the routine of a person who lives somewhere. Coffee before the dog walk before the work calls from the study with the north window showing him the hill in whatever mood November had given it. Carla came on Thursdays, usually for 2 or 3 hours, and Nathan worked alongside her when his schedule allowed, learning things about the garden's specific character, which beds held water too long, where the light hit strongest in the low winter sun, how the rose bushes along the south wall were already, despite their difficult year, showing the early signs of what Carla called deciding to come back. They do that, she'd said one Thursday, pruning shears in hand, crouching near the most bedraggled of the three. They look finished and then they just decide not to be. Nathan had written nothing down, but he'd remembered it. Eli came every other week, as the custody arrangement specified, and the weeks he was there had a different texture than the weeks he wasn't. Louder, more interrupted, containing more questions about things Nathan didn't have ready answers for, and more moments where nothing particularly remarkable happened, but the quality of the nothing was better. Captain had made his sleeping decision within the first week. Hallway Sunday through Wednesday, Eli's room Thursday through Saturday, a schedule he maintained with the consistency of someone who had given it serious thought. The tomato bed became a fixed point of conversation. Eli had appointed himself its primary advocate, which meant he mentioned it regularly, updated Nathan on his research, conducted via school library books and a gardening YouTube channel he'd found, and had, by mid-November, produced a handwritten list of the tomato varieties he believed they should plant in spring, organized by what he called taste priority, and how easy they are, probably. Nathan had taped the list to the refrigerator, next to the crayon drawing of the crooked chimney house. The final resolution of the estate legal matter arrived, not with drama, but with paperwork, which was appropriate for something that had always been more about narrative than law. Sylvia called on a Tuesday morning in late November while Nathan was on the back porch watching Captain conduct his daily investigation of the hedgerow, a ritual the dog performed with fresh urgency each morning as if something might have changed overnight. "It's done," she said. Nathan lowered his coffee. "Richard withdrew?" "His attorney contacted me yesterday evening. They're dropping all challenges and inquiries, including the Meridian Hill property review." A pause. No conditions, no counter-proposals. Full withdrawal. Nathan sat with this for a moment. Outside, Captain had found something in the hedgerow base worth investigating at close range and was applying his nose to it with professional focus. "What changed?" Nathan asked. "I don't know exactly. His attorney didn't say, and I didn't push. When someone gives you what you want without conditions, you say thank you and you file the paperwork." Sylvia clicked her pen twice. "But I have a theory." "Tell me." "I think the motion being denied was more significant to Richard psychologically than legally. He needed to make the move. He needed to feel like he'd tried everything. Once the court said no, and once he'd made that phone call to you, I think the story he'd been telling himself ran out of road." Another pause, more reflective than her usual. "I've seen this before in family disputes. People fight until they realize what they're actually fighting for, and once they see that clearly, sometimes they stop." Nathan looked at the hill. The frost was off it by now, mid-morning, the winter sun doing what it could at this angle and this latitude. "He called me again last week," he said. "I didn't tell you." "What did he say?" "Not much. He asked how the house was. I told him it was good. He said Douglas always did know how to pick a property." Nathan paused. "We talked for about 6 minutes. Neither of us said anything particularly important. But it wasn't the other calls. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. Nathan, you don't have to rebuild a relationship with him. I know. The legal situation being resolved doesn't obligate you to anything personal. I know that too. He watched Captain extract himself from the hedgerow investigation and trot back toward the porch with the satisfied bearing of someone who had confirmed their findings. I'm not rushing anything. I'm just leaving the door open at whatever distance makes sense. He's the only family I have left, in the direct line. My father wouldn't have wanted me to permanently cut that off if there was another option. What would your father have wanted? Sylvia asked it genuinely, not rhetorically. Nathan thought about the letter in the desk drawer, about the compass, about the view from the north window, about a man who had driven up this hill in his last difficult months and sat in a chair and looked at the hill and thought about his son and made sure the latch worked on the hallway window. He'd have wanted me to be practical about it, Nathan said, to be decent without being naive, to not let it cost me anything I wasn't willing to pay. He paused, and to deal with it in my own time, not anyone else's. Then do that, Sylvia said, in her most practical tone, which was how she expressed care. She wrapped up the call with the specifics. Documents to be signed, filings to be made, a timeline for the formal estate transfer to be completed in full. Nathan listened, confirmed, thanked her. After he hung up, he sat on the porch for a while longer with Captain at his feet, the dog having concluded his morning business and settled into the state of peaceful adjacency that seemed to be his primary mode. The estate was Nathan's, completely, finally, without contest. He didn't feel triumphant. He'd expected to feel something sharper than this, some release, some satisfying click of resolution. Instead, what he felt was quieter, a settling, like the compass needle after it swung and stilled. The thing that was his was his. What he was going to do with it was still being determined. He'd been thinking about the estate, not about fighting for it or defending it. Those conversations were over. He'd been thinking about what it was and what it was going to be, now that the noise around it had stopped and he could look at it clearly. The property itself was beautiful. He knew this because he'd grown up around it, had spent school breaks running the grounds and knowing which trees were climbable and which weren't, had eaten at the long dining room table more times than he could count. It had 30 years of complicated feelings built into the walls, as his father had written, and that was true. But it also had value, real, considerable value. And what you did with things of value, once you'd stopped fighting over them, was a practical question his father would have respected. He had an idea. He'd been letting it develop slowly, the way he let most ideas develop, not forcing it into a decision before it was ready, but not ignoring it either. Letting it sit in the study with him in the evenings, turning it over the way he turned the compass over. He called David Farron that afternoon. Farron answered on the second ring, as people who've been waiting for a call sometimes do. Nathan, good to hear from you. You too. I wanted to ask you something about the estate. Not the legal situation, that's resolved. Something else. Of course. The sound of Farron moving, adjusting, giving the call his attention. What are you thinking? I want to know what my father had considered doing with it, long term. He must have had thoughts. A pause. He did. We talked about it several times over the years. Farron's voice shifted into the register of someone accessing real memory rather than professional summary. He went back and forth. His default preference, for a long time, was to keep it in the family, which meant passing it to you, which is what he did. But in the last 2 years, as his health changed, he started thinking about other options. Not selling. He didn't want to sell it to a stranger, but possibly repurposing it, turning it towards something. What kind of something? He mentioned a foundation, an educational program possibly, something connected to the arts or to early career professionals who needed resources. Farron paused. He never settled on a specific model. He said he wanted you to make that decision because you'd be better positioned to know what made sense once the dust settled. Nathan was in the study, the north window showing the hill in its afternoon configuration. The compass was on the desk corner. He said that specifically, Nathan asked, that he wanted me to decide? His exact words were, Farron paused, and Nathan could hear him remembering, recalling the specific weight of a sentence. Nathan will know what to do with it once he's not fighting for it. He's better than I was at building things from the ground up. Let him decide. Nathan set the phone down briefly, not to end the call, just to pick up the compass and hold it, a reflex he'd developed over the past months. He brought the phone back up. I want to start a conversation, Nathan said, about a foundation, something connected to the estate. I have a rough shape of what I'm thinking, and I want to hear what you know about how my father's financial structure would support it. I can do that, Farron said. I have availability Thursday afternoon. Thursday's good, Nathan said. After he hung up, he wrote 3 pages of notes in a yellow legal pad he kept in the top desk drawer. Not a plan yet, just the rough shape of one, the way a house looks before you put the walls up, and you can still see all the spaces at once and understand how they might connect. He wrote quickly, the way he wrote when something was ready to come out, and when he stopped, he looked at the pages and felt the specific energy of something that was going to become real. He told Eli about it on a Thursday evening 2 weeks later, when Eli was at the kitchen table doing homework and Nathan was making dinner, and Captain was in his hallway position, monitoring the household from what he had apparently designated as his operational base. I'm going to do something with Grandpa's estate, Nathan said. The big house. I wanted to tell you about it. Eli looked up from his worksheet. What kind of something? I'm going to turn part of it into a foundation, a place where young people can come and learn things about business, about the arts, about building careers when they're just starting out and don't have a lot of support. Nathan stirred what was on the stove. It would be called the Douglas Caldwell Foundation. Eli was quiet for a moment, in the way he got quiet when he was actually thinking rather than just processing. After Grandpa. After Grandpa. He'd like that? Nathan considered this honestly. I think he'd find a reason to critique the implementation, he said. But yeah, I think he'd like the idea. Eli nodded slowly. Can I help? With the foundation? When I'm older, like eventually. He said it with the matter-of-fact long-term thinking of a child who had grown up watching his father build things incrementally. I could work there or something. Nathan looked at his son, the homework in front of him, the kitchen table with the shimmied leg, Captain's tail visible around the corner of the hallway door frame, the tomato list on the refrigerator. Yeah, Nathan said. When you're older, we'll figure that out. Eli returned to his homework with the satisfied air of someone who had received a commitment and logged it. Nathan turned back to the stove, and the kitchen was quiet except for the ordinary sounds of a weeknight dinner being made in a house where people lived. The formal launch of the Douglas Caldwell Foundation was still months away when spring came to Meridian Hill, but the groundwork was in place. The legal structure established with Sylvia's guidance, the financial framework built with Farron's input, the first conversations held with the estate's property manager about how to adapt the building for its new purpose while preserving what Douglas had loved about it. A local architectural firm was involved. A board of advisors was being assembled, slowly and deliberately, from people Nathan trusted to carry the work forward rather than just carry the title. It was a significant undertaking. Nathan was not naive about that. He had run Caldwell Strategic Partners for 12 years and knew the difference between a good idea and a good idea that had been adequately resourced and structured, and he was applying the same rigor to the foundation that he'd applied to building his firm. It would take time. Things worth doing usually did. But the spring morning that Eli came up to Meridian Hill, and the two of them stood in the south garden at the raised bed, and Carla showed Eli how to plant the first tomato seedlings, Cherokee Purple, which had been at the top of Eli's taste priority list. That morning had nothing to do with the foundation or the estate or the legal resolution or any of the larger architecture of Nathan's rebuilt life. It was just a morning. Eli with his hands in the soil, asking questions Carla answered without condescension, pushing the seedlings into the bed with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that small things needed to be handled correctly or they didn't become the large things they were supposed to be. Captain patrolling the garden perimeter, the hill in its spring configuration, the tree line doing something green and new that winter had withheld. Nathan stood slightly back and watched and did not say much. There was nothing he needed to add to the moment. It was already complete. Eli looked up from the bed. He had soil on his cheek and didn't know it. How long until they grow? He asked Carla. Couple of months, she said. You'll see the first ones in July. I'll be here in July, Eli said, with the certainty of someone confirming an appointment. Then you'll see them, Carla said. Eli looked at Nathan. "We'll be here in July." "We'll be here," Nathan confirmed. Eli nodded and went back to his planting. Carla caught Nathan's eye briefly and didn't say anything, which was one of the things Nathan had come to appreciate about her. She understood when a moment didn't need commentary. In the evenings that spring, Nathan developed the habit of sitting on the back porch after dinner when the weather allowed, which in March was barely, and in April with increasing frequency, and by May consistently. He'd bring his coffee or sometimes a glass of something, and Captain would settle near his feet, and he'd sit in the less comfortable chair, still his chair, still not replaced, and look at the hill going through its evening transitions. He thought, in those evenings, about a lot of things. About the foundation and its progress, which was slower than he'd hoped and more complicated than he'd expected, because the right things usually were. About Caldwell's strategic partners and this question he'd been sitting with for 2 years about what the next phase of the firm looked like, whether he wanted to grow it further or find a different shape for it, a question he hadn't answered yet and was still comfortable not having answered. About Eli, who was 8 now, who had started reading longer books and had an opinion about everything, and had recently announced at dinner that he intended to be either a marine biologist or an architect, and that he would decide by the time he was 12. He thought about Margaret sometimes, with the specific kind of thinking that comes after the rawness of a thing is entirely gone, and what's left is just clarity, recognition of what had been real, acknowledgement of what had been a failure, appreciation for the shape of what they'd managed to build after. She had a person in her life now, a quiet man named Paul, who was a structural engineer and who Eli described as fine, actually pretty funny sometimes, which Nathan understood as a solid endorsement from a child who was watching carefully and being honest. He thought about his father constantly, but differently than he had in the first months at Meridian House. In the beginning, his father's presence in the house had felt immediate and sometimes raw. The chair in the study, the view from the north window, the letter in the drawer. Now it had settled into something steadier. Douglas was in the details of the place, not haunting them, but inhabiting them, the way people who have taken care of something with love are always present in the quality of the care. The window latch worked. The floors had been kept right. The garden, once neglected, was coming back. Nathan understood by spring something he hadn't fully understood in the rainy autumn, when he'd carried his cardboard box away from a gate and walked to his car. His father had not just built him a house. He had built him an argument against the story Richard and people like Richard told about who mattered and who didn't, who belonged and who had forfeited the right to belong, who was a real Caldwell, and who was, as Richard had said in the rain, not the person the family wanted. Douglas Caldwell's answer to that story had not been a speech or a confrontation. It had been a property transfer, executed years in advance, handled through meticulous documentation, staffed by a property manager who tested the kitchen equipment and noted the latch on the hallway window and kept a note from a dead man for the right moment. It had been, "Here is a home that reflects what you've built and who you are, not what you've been willing to settle for." It had been, "You are a good father. That matters more than any of the rest of it." It had been, "It's been waiting. So have I." Nathan was not a man who usually talked to absent people, not out loud, not formally, but some evenings, sitting on the porch with Captain and the hill, and the garden, doing what the garden did. Now that it had been given attention, he'd have something in his mind that was shaped like a report, something he'd give Douglas if Douglas were across the porch in the other chair, the mismatched one. It would go something like, "The house is good. The latch works." The rose bushes decided to come back. Eli has a room that he reorganized himself on the first day, and he has a dog, medium-sized as recommended, who sleeps in the hallway with the intermittent exception of Eli's room, and we are going to have tomatoes in July. The foundation is taking shape. It will carry your name, which is better than the alternative. Richard and I don't talk often, but we talk, and it is not warm exactly, but it is civil, and occasionally something in it is almost honest, and I think you would find that adequate. I found the room you left me. I moved into it. It took longer than it should have. The answer, in the version of this he ran in his head, was always the same. It came back in his father's voice, quiet and dry and precise. The voice that had left a note for a property manager and a compass in a box and a letter sealed until the right conditions were met. Took you long enough. Nathan would smile at that, in the evenings, and Captain would lift his head to check whether smiling meant something was happening, determine it didn't, and put his head back down. There is something that happens to a person when they stop living inside a story other people wrote for them. It doesn't happen dramatically. It's not a single moment, not a revelation that reorganizes everything at once. It happens the way the garden recovered, in Carla's terminology, slowly, from the root up, the visible signs arriving after the invisible ones. One day you notice that you haven't spent any of the past week managing the perception of your own life, performing adequacy for someone else's audience, defending your choices to an internal court that was never actually your own. One day you realize the person you're accounting to is just yourself, and that this is both simpler and more demanding than the previous arrangement. Nathan Caldwell was not a better person than he'd been in the apartment. He made the same mistakes in roughly the same distribution, overcommitting on work timelines, forgetting to call people back, taking too long to say difficult things that would have been easier said earlier. He had not been healed by the house, or transformed by the legal victory, or made whole by his father's posthumous instructions. He was the same imperfect, occasionally distracted, frequently tired man who had stood in the rain outside a gate holding a cardboard box and chosen silence over argument. What was different was the ground under him. He could feel it, not as a metaphor, but as an actual physical fact, in the way the house sat on the hill and the hill sat on its foundation, and the foundation didn't shift when the weather changed. He had built things that were real, a firm, a fatherhood, now a house that was becoming itself, and a foundation taking shape from an estate that had been fought over and then redirected into something better. These things were his in the way that nothing can take from you. Not because no one would try, but because what they were was built from the inside out, not assigned from the outside in. The people who close a door against you, Nathan had come to understand, are not always doing you a disservice. Richard Caldwell, standing in the rain with his hands on an iron gate, telling his nephew he didn't belong. That moment had cost Nathan something. It had cost him the last remnant of a story he'd been telling himself about the family and his place in it. A story he'd been revising and accommodating for decades, finding ways to make it bearable. The gate closed and the story ended, and that was painful. And he'd driven away in the rain and sat in his kitchen for 2 hours and felt the full weight of it. And then he'd called Sylvia, and she'd already sent his number to Helen, and the house had been waiting, and his father had left him a compass and a letter, and a view from a north window that showed him a hill in every possible configuration of light. And his son had reorganized a room on the first day and called it his. And a dog had settled into the hallway and declared it operational. And a garden had decided to come back from a difficult year, and tomatoes were growing in a raised bed along the south wall that Eli had helped plant on a spring morning with soil on his cheek. None of this came from the gate staying open. All of it came from walking away from it. That was the thing Nathan turned over in the evenings on the porch. Not as a lesson exactly. He was suspicious of lessons that wrapped too cleanly, but as an observation. As a fact worth noting, the way his father noted facts, without ceremony, precisely, for the permanent record. Some doors are not meant for you. The ones that close against you are sometimes doing the closing because you were about to walk through something that would have kept you small, that would have used up the years you needed for the thing you were actually supposed to be building. The people who shut them sometimes believe they're taking something from you. Occasionally they are. But occasionally, more occasionally than it seems possible to believe when you're standing in the rain, they are accidentally, unwittingly, in the middle of their own worst impulse, doing you the service of pointing you somewhere you would never have turned to on your own. Richard Caldwell had pointed Nathan Caldwell toward Meridian Hill. He would never know that. Nathan had no plans to tell him. Sick. The tomatoes came in the second week of July, as Carla had predicted. Not all at once, 3 or 4 at first, then more each day. The Cherokee purples coming in that particular dark red-green that looks almost wrong until you taste one and understand that they knew exactly what they were doing. Eli was there for the first harvest, which Nathan had arranged without calling it arranged. He'd known from the planting date and Carla's estimate roughly when the first ones would be ready, and he'd made sure that particular Thursday was a Meridian Hill Thursday. They picked them together in the morning, Eli moving down the row with the focused satisfaction of someone reaping something he'd put into the ground himself, Captain sitting at the garden's edge, watching with his ears in their usual state of conflicting position. The sun was doing what July sun did at that hour on the south-facing garden wall, direct and warm without being oppressive. The wall holding and reflecting it in a way that had been planned, Nathan now understood, by whoever designed the original garden. Eli held up a tomato the size of his fist. "This one's mine," he said. "That one's yours," Nathan agreed. "I'm eating it right now." He bit into it, standing there in the garden, the juice running. He chewed, considered, nodded with the authority of someone whose taste priority list had just been vindicated. "It's really good." "Yeah? Really good." He offered it across. "Try it." Nathan took a bite, standing in the July garden on Meridian Hill, with his son and his dog, and the hill stretching out behind the south wall, and his father's house visible over Eli's shoulder, the north study window catching the morning light in a way that meant, from this angle, you could see straight through to the back side of the building where the other windows were. The tomato was good, genuinely good, the way things are when they've been grown in the right conditions by people who paid attention. "Okay," Nathan said. "You were right about the Cherokee purple." "I know," Eli said, and went back to picking. Nathan picked alongside him, and Captain watched, and the garden did what gardens do on mornings in July when summer is fully itself, and there is nothing urgent demanding anything from you, and the thing you planned in winter is proving itself correct. Later, after the harvest and the lunch, Eli made himself insist on cooking, which was scrambled eggs with questionable technique and excellent confidence, and after the afternoon of various things, and after the dinner that was better than the eggs, and after Eli was picked up at 6 and hugged Nathan at the front door with the matter-of-fact affection of a child who was secure in where things stood, Nathan went back to the study. He sat in the chair that had been his father's. He looked at the north window and the hill beyond it, and the compass on the corner of the desk, and the legal pad where 3 months ago he'd written the rough shape of what would become the Douglas Caldwell Foundation. He pulled the legal pad toward him. He turned to a fresh page. He started writing, not about the foundation this time, not about logistics or structures or board composition or any of the architecture of moving forward. He wrote about his father, about a man who loved in preparation and planned for the futures of the people he cared about with more precision than he ever managed for himself. About what it was like to discover, slowly, over months in a house on a hill, that someone had already seen you clearly enough to give you exactly what you needed before you knew you needed it. He wrote for a long time. The hill went through its evening changes outside the window, the flattening light, the long shadows, the moment when everything goes amber and then quickly doesn't, the particular purple-gray of a July dusk on a hillside. He wasn't writing it for anyone. He was writing it because it needed to be written, because some things need to exist in words to be fully real, and because his father had communicated in documents and arrangements and notes left with property managers. And Nathan was, after all, Douglas Caldwell's son. When he stopped, it was dark outside. Captain had come in at some point and was in his hallway position, monitoring. The compass needle pointed north, as it always did, as it had always done since his grandfather's hands had held it, and his father's hands had held it, and now his. He put the pen down. He folded the pages and put them in the drawer, next to the letter with the F that had the hook at the top. He sat for a moment in the dark study, the lamp on, the hill invisible now but present the way things are present when you know them well enough that darkness doesn't change them. Then he got up, turned the lamp off, and went to make the last coffee of the day. In the kitchen his father had been specific about, at the counter height Douglas Caldwell had insisted on, in the house that had been waiting. He was home.